Hi, I'm Emily. I'll be your storyteller today. Many of you use these stories to fall asleep. So before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Also, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now get comfortable. Close your eyes and let the sound of the rain guide you into the story. My life is measured in spreadsheets. As a data analyst for a mid-level logistics firm, my days are a quiet, orderly progression of numbers, charts, and projections. I find a strange comfort in the predictability of it all. The world outside may be chaotic and loud, but in my small cubicle on the 7th floor, everything has its place. Every problem has a logical solution that can be found by carefully examining the data. It is a safe, controlled, and utterly predictable existence, and for the most part, I like it that way. My desk, a standard landscape of beige plastic and gray fabric, has one remarkable feature: the window. It looks out over the city, but its most prominent view is of the elevated train line that runs parallel to our building. The tracks are old, rusted, and loud, a relic from another era of public transit. Every half hour, a train rumbles past, a fleeting metal serpent, filled with the anonymous faces of strangers, each on their own predictable journey. The trains are a part of the office's ambient noise, a rhythmic interruption that most of my colleagues have learned to tune out completely. But for me, they are a brief, welcome distraction. A small moving window into the wider world beyond my spreadsheets. I'll often pause my work for a moment, look up from my screen, and watch the cars slide by. It's a form of people watching, but a detached, impersonal version of it. I see them, but they, of course, never see me. My days are defined by this routine. I arrive at 8, I brew my coffee, I analyze my data, and I watch the trains. The 9:45 is always crowded with commuters. The 12:15 is usually half empty, filled with shoppers and tourists. But my favorite, the one that has become a fixed point in my afternoon, is the 3:15. It passes just as the post-lunch slump begins to set in, a welcome jolt of sound and motion in the quietest part of the day. The 3:15 is always the same number of cars, the same rumbling sound, the same speed. It's as predictable as the data on my screen. I've come to see it as a kind of companion, a silent, inanimate partner in my daily routine. Its arrival marks the beginning of the final stretch of my workday, a signal that the end is in sight. It is a mundane, meaningless, and deeply comforting ritual. The passengers are a blur of humanity. I see them in brief 2-second snapshots. A woman reading a book, a man talking on his phone, a child pressing their face against the glass. They are characters in a silent movie, their stories imagined and then forgotten as soon as the train has passed. This anonymity is crucial. They are not real people to me. They are just data points, fleeting images that add a small, interesting variable to my otherwise unchanging day. My life, both in and out of the office, is built on this foundation of safety and predictability. I live in a quiet apartment. I have a small circle of good friends, and I find my joy in simple, orderly things. I am not a person who seeks out drama or chaos. My greatest ambition is to live a peaceful, stable life, free from the kind of unexpected events that can derail a person. My world is a carefully curated spreadsheet of my own design. My corner of the office building is my domain. I have my favorite mug, a small collection of succulents on my windowsill, and a photo of my sister and me on my desk. It is a personalized space within a larger, impersonal corporation. My window provides light, a view, and a sense of connection to the city that I can observe from a safe, sterile distance. I am a spectator, not a participant, and that is exactly how I like it. I have never felt vulnerable here. The office is a secure building, with keycard access and a security guard in the lobby. My work is abstract, dealing with numbers and logistics, not people. I am several floors up, sealed behind a thick pane of glass. The world can rumble past my window, but it cannot touch me. This feeling of detached security is the bedrock of my contentment. I am an observer in a glass tower. And so the 3:15 train was just another part of this landscape, a piece of moving scenery, a harmless daily event that meant nothing more than the time of day. I had no reason to believe it could ever become anything else. I was blissfully unaware that a single, repeated glance from one of those anonymous passengers was about to corrupt my most trusted data set, my own sense of safety. The routine was about to become a ritual of terror. The gentle rumble of the passing train was a sound I associated with the comforting rhythms of my job. It was as familiar as the clicking of my keyboard or the low hum of the office ventilation system. It was a sound that signified continuity. As long as the trains were running on time, the world was functioning as it should. This belief, however foolish, was a cornerstone of my quiet, orderly life. My world was a machine, and the train was one of its most reliable gears. I took a certain pleasure in the sheer randomness of the faces I would see. Each window on the train was a tiny, fleeting portrait of a life in progress. A student with their head buried in a textbook, a construction worker covered in dust, a tourist pointing out a landmark to their companion. They were all part of the vast, intricate data set of the city, and from my vantage point, I could see the patterns without having to engage with the messy, unpredictable human details. There was a profound sense of one-way observation that I found comforting. I could see them, but to them, I was utterly invisible. I was just one person in one window of a massive glass and steel building filled with hundreds of other windows, hundreds of other anonymous office workers. There was no reason for any passenger to ever single out my specific window from the vast reflective grid. This anonymity was my shield. My colleagues rarely even noticed the trains anymore. They were focused on their screens, their phone calls, their own spreadsheets. My quiet fascination with the passing cars was a private quirk, a small, secret ritual that belonged only to me. It was my own personal connection to the pulse of the city, a connection that demanded nothing from me in return. I could watch, observe, and then return to my work, completely unaffected. The end of my workday was as predictable as its beginning. At 5 o'clock, I would save my final spreadsheet, tidy my desk, and shut down my computer. I would say my goodbyes to my colleagues and take the elevator down to the quiet, marble-floored lobby. The walk to the subway station was always the same, my mind already shifting from the logic of logistics to the simple domestic thoughts of what to make for dinner. My life was a series of these quiet, ordered transitions, from my apartment to the subway, from the subway to the office, and then back again. Each stage of my day was a familiar, comfortable space with its own set of rules and expectations. There were no surprises. There was no chaos. I had built a life that was designed to be as free from unexpected variables as possible. It was not an exciting life, perhaps, but it was a safe one. And safety was the most important thing to me. I had seen enough chaos in the lives of others to know that I wanted no part of it. I cherished my peace, my quiet, my routine. The window, overlooking the train tracks, was a perfect metaphor for my ideal relationship with the world. Close enough to watch, but far enough away to be completely removed from the noise, the danger, and the unpredictability of it all. The faces in the train were just that, faces. They were not people with histories, with problems, with intentions. They were fleeting images, as ephemeral as the rumble of the train itself. They would appear for a few seconds, and then vanish forever, replaced by the next train, the next set of faces. It never occurred to me that one of those faces might see me back. It never occurred to me that one of them might not be fleeting at all. I had built my fortress of routine and observation, convinced of its impenetrable walls. I felt secure in my role as the unseen watcher, the data analyst studying the patterns of the world from a safe remove. I was the one behind the glass, and that glass was a one-way mirror. The idea that someone could look back, that they could single me out from the crowd, was not just unlikely. It was, in my mind, impossible. But I was wrong. My belief in my own invisibility was the flaw in my security system. I was about to learn that no window is ever truly a one-way mirror. Someone on the other side can always choose to press their face against the glass, to cup their hands and peer inside. One of the data points was about to become an anomaly, and my entire carefully constructed spreadsheet of a life was about to be corrupted. The day it started was a Wednesday, a day of remarkable unremarkableness. The data was clean, the spreadsheets were behaving, and the quiet hum of the office was a familiar comfort. I remember staring at a particularly complex set of logistics, projections, my mind deep in the numbers. The distant rumble of the approaching 3:15 train was a welcome, familiar sound, a signal to my subconscious that the afternoon was proceeding exactly as planned. As always, I lifted my head and glanced out the window. The train rushed into view, a blur of silver and grime. My eyes, as they always did, unfocused slightly, taking in the fleeting slideshow of passengers without really seeing them. It was my usual passive observation, a collection of shapes and colors, a woman laughing on her phone, a man in a suit, sleeping with his mouth open. The normal, anonymous tapestry of the city. But then, something broke the pattern. My eyes, for no particular reason, snagged on one window, one face, and the face was looking back. It was a man. His features were indistinct at that distance and speed, but his gaze was not. He was staring directly at my window, at me. In a sea of faces looking at their phones, at each other, or at nothing at all, his focus was a laser beam. For a split second, our eyes locked. The one-way mirror of my window shattered. The profound sense of being an invisible observer evaporated, replaced by the startling, electric shock of being seen. The train was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only the fading rumble and the image of his focused gaze burned into my mind. I sat there, my spreadsheet forgotten, my heart beating just a little faster than usual. It was a strange feeling, a bizarre and unexpected connection with a complete stranger. It was nothing, of course, a coincidence. He was likely just looking at the building, and his gaze had happened to align with my window for a brief moment. I forced myself to dismiss it. In a city of millions, strange, fleeting moments of eye contact were bound to happen. It was a statistical probability, another data point in the vast chaos of urban life. It meant nothing. I turned back to my work, deliberately focusing on the clean, logical world of my numbers, and tried to forget the unsettling feeling of being singled out, of being seen when I was supposed to be invisible. But the memory of the moment lingered at the edge of my thoughts for the rest of the afternoon. It was a small, persistent anomaly in an otherwise perfect data set. The feeling was not one of fear, not yet. It was one of profound, startling surprise. The rules of my world had been momentarily broken. The observer had been observed. I found myself looking forward to going home, to being back in my own private space where I was in control of who was allowed to see me. The next day, I was determined to ignore the 3:15 train. I told myself it was a foolish distraction. As the familiar rumble began to build in the distance, I kept my eyes firmly fixed on my computer screen. I would not look up. I would not give the coincidence any more power over my thoughts. I would simply work, and the train would pass, as it always did, and the moment would be forgotten. But my resolve was weaker than my curiosity, against my better judgment. My eyes flickered up towards the window as the train rattled past. I scanned the windows of the passing cars, my heart giving a small, anxious flutter. I told myself I was just looking out of habit, but I knew, with a sinking feeling, that I was looking for him. I was looking to see if the anomaly would repeat itself. I was conducting an experiment, and I was terrified of the potential result. And there he was. He was in the same car, sitting in the same seat as the day before, and he was looking directly at my window. There was no ambiguity this time. He was not glancing at the building. His head was turned, his focus absolute. His face was still a blur, but his intent was crystal clear. He was watching for me. He was waiting for me to look up. As my eyes met his, I felt a genuine chill run down my spine. This was no longer a coincidence. A single instance is an anomaly. A second instance is the beginning of a pattern. And my entire life was built on the analysis of patterns. This was a pattern I did not want to see. I quickly looked away, my face flushing, feeling a strange mixture of fear and a bizarre kind of violation. The detached observer was now the subject of observation. The rules of the game had been completely inverted. I immediately dropped my gaze back to my spreadsheet, but the numbers were just a meaningless jumble of black pixels on a white screen. I could feel his eyes on me, even though the train was now gone. The feeling of being watched was a physical sensation, a pressure on my skin. I felt exposed, pinned in place by the gaze of a complete stranger. My 7th floor window no longer a shield, but a display case. My safe, anonymous perch had become a stage. My logical mind, the part of me that dealt in data and probabilities, went into overdrive, desperately trying to find a rational explanation. Perhaps he worked in a building behind mine, and he used my window as a landmark to know when his stop was approaching. Or maybe he was an architect, fascinated by the design of our building. I constructed a dozen plausible, non-threatening scenarios, but none of them felt right. They were just stories I was telling myself to keep the fear at bay. The rest of the afternoon was unproductive. My focus was shattered. I found myself staring out the window, not at the trains, but at the empty space where the train had been, my mind replaying that brief, intense moment of connection. The man's face was still a blur, an indistinct shape, but his intent, his focus, was the sharpest, clearest thing I had ever seen. He was not just a passenger, he was an observer. When I left work that evening, the city felt different. I was more aware of the people around me on the subway platform, more conscious of the faces in the crowd. Every casual glance from a stranger felt weighted with a new, potentially sinister significance. The comfortable anonymity of the city, which had always been a source of freedom, now felt like a veil behind which a threat could be hiding. The man on the train had infected my entire worldview with his stare. Back in the safety of my apartment, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I cooked dinner, I called my sister, I went through the motions of my normal evening routine, but the image of the man was a persistent afterimage in my mind. He had successfully breached the walls of my office and had followed me home, not in person, but as a thought, an idea, a new and unwelcome source of anxiety that I couldn't seem to shake. I knew that this was the real test. What would happen? Tomorrow at 3:15? Would he be there again? The question became the focal point of my entire existence. A part of me, the rational part, wanted to ignore it completely. To keep my head down, to not look out the window, to deny him the satisfaction of my attention. To do so would be to reclaim my power, to end the game before it truly began. But another, more powerful part of me knew that I wouldn't be able to resist. The need to know, the compulsion to confirm the pattern, was overwhelming my mind. So, accustomed to analyzing data and identifying trends, could not simply ignore this new terrifying variable. I had to know if he would be there. I had to see for myself if this was a true pattern or just a bizarre, 2-day coincidence. That night, my sleep was troubled. I dreamt of trains, of endless rows of windows, and of a single focused pair of eyes that followed me no matter where. I tried to hide. I woke up feeling tired, a sense of dread already settled in my stomach for the day ahead. The 3:15 train was no longer a mundane part of my schedule. It was an appointment, a confrontation, and it was still hours away. The day passed with agonizing slowness. I watched the clock on my computer screen, each passing minute a tick closer to the moment of truth. My work was a blur of unread emails and meaningless numbers. My entire being was focused on that one specific moment in the afternoon. The train, my former comforting companion, had become a source of profound dread, a daily harbinger of a deeply personal and unsettling mystery. I had become a participant in something I did not understand. The passive observer had been drawn into the frame, and I had no idea what the rules of this new game were, or who my opponent was. All I knew was that at 3:15, a train would pass my window, and I, despite every rational instinct telling me not to, would look up. I had to. I had to see the face in the crowd. The workday was a long, slow crawl towards 3:15. I tried to immerse myself in my work, to build a wall of data and spreadsheets around my consciousness, but it was useless. A small, anxious part of my brain was dedicated solely to watching the clock, counting down the minutes to the afternoon's unwanted appointment. My office, once my sanctuary of calm focus, now felt like a waiting room, and I was dreading my name being called. The routine had become a countdown to a specific moment of dread. As the time approached, my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tensed, my heart rate quickened, and I found myself holding my breath. It was a physiological response to a perceived threat, an instinct I couldn't control. I made a conscious decision not to look this time. I would keep my eyes on my screen. I would be strong. I would break the cycle by refusing to participate. He could stare all he wanted at an empty window. I would not give him the satisfaction. The distant rumble began, a familiar sound that now sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I kept my gaze fixed on my monitor, my knuckles white as I gripped my mouse. The rumble grew louder, closer. I could feel the faint vibration through the floor. Don't look. Don't look. Don't look, I repeated to myself, a frantic, silent mantra. But it was like telling myself not to think of a pink elephant. The compulsion was overwhelming. My eyes betrayed me. Of their own accord, they lifted from the screen and turned towards the window just as the train sped into view. My breath caught in my throat, and there he was. It was him. Same car, same seat, his face turned towards me with an unnerving stillness. There was no question now, no room for coincidence or doubt. He was there for me. His presence was a fixed point in the chaos of the city, a daily, unwavering constant. And he was not just looking, he was staring. It was a gaze devoid of any normal human curiosity. It was a flat, possessive, and deeply unsettling stare. It was the look of a scientist observing a specimen, of a collector appraising an object. In that brief, 3-second window as the train passed, I felt pinned by his gaze, stripped of my anonymity, and reduced to an object of his intense, unexplained focus. He wasn't just a face in the crowd anymore. He was my daily observer. I let out a shuddering breath as the train disappeared, the spell broken. The fear was no longer a quiet, creeping thing. It was a loud, screaming presence in my head. This was not a game. This was not a coincidence. This was harassment of a strange, distant, and untraceable kind. He had successfully turned a symbol of my freedom, my window on the world, into the bars of a cage. And he returned every day to look at the animal he had trapped inside. The days that followed fell into a new, horrifying routine. Every afternoon, the dread would begin to build around 3 o'clock. The rumble of the train would start, and despite my best efforts, my promises to myself to ignore it, I would always look. I had to. The need to confirm his presence, to know for sure that I wasn't imagining it, was a compulsion I could not fight. And every day he was there, waiting for me. His presence began to poison my entire workday. I couldn't concentrate. My productivity plummeted. My spreadsheets were filled with errors. My mind was consumed with him. Who was he? What did he want? Why me? The questions were a constant, tormenting loop with no answers. My safe, orderly world was being systematically dismantled by the simple, repeated act of a man staring at me from a moving train. I started to feel a strange, perverse connection to him. He was a part of my life now, a fixed, terrifying feature of my daily landscape. I knew nothing about him, and yet, he was the most consistent presence in my day, besides my colleagues. This forced intimacy was a profound violation. He had inserted himself into my life without my consent, creating a one-sided relationship that was built entirely on my fear and his unwavering, silent observation. My sense of safety was completely gone. I started to feel watched even when I wasn't at the office. On the subway home, I would scan the faces of the other passengers, searching for his. I would look over my shoulder as I walked down the street. He had planted a seed of paranoia that was now growing, its roots spreading into every corner of my life. The man on the train was no longer just on the train. He was in my head. After a week of this silent, daily torment, I decided to try and fight back in the only way I could. I tried glaring at him, my expression a mixture of anger and defiance, but it had no effect. His gaze remained unchanged, impassive, his face a neutral mask. My anger was a stone thrown into a vast, silent ocean. It made no ripple, no impact. He was not looking for a reaction. He was simply observing, documenting, his purpose a complete and terrifying mystery. My next strategy was avoidance. I began closing the blinds on my window at 3 o'clock every afternoon. It was a small act of rebellion, a way of drawing a curtain on his performance, but it brought me no peace. I would sit there, in the artificial gloom of my cubicle, my heart pounding, knowing that he was out there, passing by, staring at my closed blinds. The knowledge of his gaze was just as terrifying as the gaze itself. I had blocked his view, but I had not blocked his presence. Closing the blinds felt like a surrender, an admission that he had successfully chased me from my own window. After 2 days, I stopped. I couldn't stand the feeling of hiding in my own space. I opened them again, a stubborn, foolish act of defiance. I would not let him make me afraid of the daylight. I would not let him control my environment. I would face him. And so, the horrifying, silent daily appointment resumed. My gaze, unwillingly drawn to his every afternoon. I thought about reporting him, but the absurdity of the thought stopped me every time. What would I say? There's a man on a public train who looks in my general direction every day. It wasn't a crime to look out of a window. I had no proof of malicious intent. I had nothing but a feeling, a deep and certain dread that would sound like baseless paranoia to any rational authority figure. I was trapped in a situation where the harassment was so subtle, it was legally invisible. My work became my only refuge, but it was a flimsy one. I would try to lose myself in the numbers, to build a fortress of focus so high that the 3:15 train couldn't penetrate it. But it was always there, a ticking clock in the back of my mind. The rumble would begin, and my fortress would crumble, my concentration shattered. He had successfully inserted himself into the very rhythm of my professional life, a virus in my operating system. I started to feel like an animal in a zoo. My office, my desk, my window, it was my enclosure. And every day at the same time, a visitor would come and stare at me through the glass. He would watch me work, watch me sip my coffee, watch me exist. The feeling of being constantly, passively judged was excruciating. I began to second-guess my every move, my every expression. Was I sitting the right way? Did I look stressed? What was he seeing? The other passengers on the train remained a blur, a rotating cast of anonymous extras. Only he was in sharp focus. He had detached himself from the crowd and had become a singular, terrifying entity. He was the man on the train. His identity was defined entirely by his relationship to me, to my window. He existed only in those 3-second intervals, a ghost who appeared on a schedule to haunt my afternoon. My sense of powerlessness was absolute. He was in motion, protected by the speed and steel of the train, while I was stationary, a fixed target. He could observe me, but I could not truly observe him. His face was always too indistinct, his form just a shape behind the grimy glass. He held all the power in our strange, silent relationship. I was the subject, pinned to the board, and he was the collector, returning each day to admire his specimen. After 2 full weeks of this, the dread had become a permanent part of my emotional landscape. The 3:15 was no longer just a moment in my day. It was the sun around which my entire day revolved. My mornings were filled with a low-grade, anticipatory anxiety. My afternoons were ruined by the aftermath of his stare. he was consuming my life, 3 seconds at a time. I knew that something had to change. I could not continue to live like this, a prisoner in my own office, tormented by a silent, passing phantom. The passive observation was becoming unbearable. I found myself almost wishing he would do something else, something to break the horrifying monotony. It was a foolish, dangerous wish, and I was about to get it. The observer was about to become an actor. That foolish wish, the desire for something to break the pattern, haunted me for the rest of the day. It was a testament to how frayed my nerves had become. I was so desperate for the psychological torture of his silent daily stare to end that I was willing to risk an escalation, just for a change of pace. I was inviting a new move in a game I did not understand, a foolish and reckless act born of pure desperation. I would come to regret that wish more than anything. The next day, the air in the office felt particularly heavy, charged with my own self-inflicted anticipation. I had wished for a change, and now I was terrified of what that change might be. Would he not be there? That felt like the best-case scenario, an answer to a prayer. Or would he be there, but with a new, more terrifying form of observation? As the clock ticked towards 3:15, my anxiety reached a fever pitch. I had opened Pandora's box with my desperate wish, and I was about to see what horrors flew out. The rumble began, the familiar harbinger of my daily torment. I took a deep breath. My hands clenched into fists under my desk. I looked up at the window, my gaze steady. I would not flinch. I would not look away. Whatever was about to happen, I would face it head on. I would be a scientist, observing the results of my own terrible experiment. The train burst into view, a silver streak against the pale afternoon sky. He was there. Of course he was there. Same seat, same car, same unnerving stillness. His face was turned towards me, his gaze as fixed and as intense as ever. For a moment, my heart sank with a strange mixture of terror and disappointment. It was the same. Nothing had changed. My wish had been for naught. It was just going to be another 3 seconds of his silent, possessive stare. Another day of the same psychological torture. But then, something did change. He moved. For the first time in weeks, I saw him perform a deliberate action. It was not a large movement, just a slight shift of his arm. He raised his hand, and in it, I saw the dark, rectangular shape of a cell phone. He was holding it up, aiming it not just at the building but directly at my window. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing, the familiar gesture so jarringly out of place in our silent, static ritual. And then I saw the flash. It was an unmistakably bright, white, instantaneous flash of a camera. It burst from his phone, a tiny star of light that seemed to suck all the air out of my lungs. It was aimed directly at me. He had taken my picture. He had taken my picture from a moving train, a permanent digital record of me sitting at my desk, a specimen in my glass cage. The sound of the train was drowned out by the roar of blood in my own ears. The train was gone. But the image of this flash was burned onto my retinas, a searing, white-hot point of violation. He had done it. He had escalated the game beyond anything I could have imagined. This was not observation anymore. This was collection. This was proof. He now possessed a piece of me, a frozen moment in time where I was his unwitting, helpless subject. The feeling of violation was so profound, it made me feel physically ill. I pushed my chair back from my desk, my body trembling uncontrollably. He had a photograph of me. A photograph that proved he was not just looking at the building. A photograph that could be used for anything. It could be posted online. It could be shown to his friends. It could be kept in a private collection. A trophy from his daily hunt. My anonymity, my last flimsy shield, had been utterly and completely obliterated by that single, brilliant flash of light. I stumbled out of my cubicle and ran to the restroom, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I locked myself in a stall and leaned against the cool metal, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. The world outside my stall, with its normal office sounds, the flush of a toilet, the running of a faucet, felt a million miles away. I was trapped in my own private bubble of terror, a bubble that had just been pierced by a flash of light from a passing train. This was the climax. This was the moment where the subtle, creeping dread had coalesced into a single, undeniable act of aggression. The game was no longer a subtle one of psychological pressure. He had crossed a line, a clear and unambiguous line. He had taken something from me, and now that he had my picture, now that he had his trophy, the only question left was a terrifying one. What was he going to do with it? I stayed in that restroom stall for a long time, my forehead pressed against the cool painted metal of the door. I tried to regulate my breathing, using the techniques I'd learned from yoga apps, but it was useless. Every inhale was a shudder, every exhale a sob. The flash was seared into my memory. It was a hostile, aggressive act, a violation that felt as intimate and as shocking as an unwanted touch. He had reached across the distance and laid a hand on me, a hand made of light. When I finally emerged, I avoided looking at my own reflection in the mirror. I didn't want to see the pale, terrified woman I knew would be staring back at me. I splashed cold water on my face, the shock of it a small, grounding sensation in the sea of my panic. I had to go back to my desk. I had to finish my day. I couldn't let him see that he had broken me, even though I knew with a terrible certainty that he had. Returning to my cubicle felt like returning to the scene of a crime. The space, once my sanctuary, now felt tainted, exposed. My chair, my desk, my computer, they were all witnesses. The window, my beautiful, wide window, now seemed like a massive accusatory eye, a portal through which the horror had come. Felt an overwhelming urge to cover it, to block out the world, but I knew it would be a futile gesture. He was already inside my head. The thought of reporting it surfaced again, this time with more urgency. But the same old roadblocks appeared. What had he done? He had taken a photograph from a public train. Was it illegal? Probably not. Was it creepy? Absolutely. But was it a crime? I could already hear the dismissive tone of the police, of my office security. It was the perfect act of aggression, one that was psychologically devastating but left no actionable evidence. The rest of the workday was a blur. I stared at my screen, pretending to work, but my mind was a maelstrom of fear and violation. The image of the flash, the knowledge of the photograph existing somewhere on his phone, consumed me. I felt a profound sense of shame, as if I had done something wrong, as if I had invited this somehow. It was the irrational guilt of the victim, but it was powerful nonetheless. Leaving the office that day felt like escaping a prison. But as I stepped out onto the busy street, I realized I had only escaped into a larger, more frightening one. The city was no longer an anonymous backdrop to my life. It was his hunting ground. He could be anywhere. He could be the man walking behind me, the face in the crowd on the subway, the person sitting in the car idling at the traffic light. He had a face, but I couldn't see it clearly enough to find him. That night, my apartment brought no comfort. Every window felt like a vulnerability. I drew all the blinds, plunging my home into a dark, claustrophobic gloom. But it didn't help. The darkness outside was where he lived, where he watched from. And now he had a piece of me with him. A digital ghost of me that he could look at whenever he wanted. The thought made my skin crawl. He had invaded my public space, and in doing so, had destroyed my private one. My sense of security was not just broken. It had been systematically dismantled and replaced with a state of constant, high-alert paranoia. I jumped at every sound. I second-guessed every shadow. The world, which had once been a predictable, orderly place, was now filled with a single, terrifying variable. Him. His presence was a poison that was spreading through every aspect of my life, tainting everything it touched. The first phase of his campaign was over. He had established his presence, escalated his surveillance, and culminated with an act of invasive documentation. He had successfully transformed me from an anonymous office worker into the specific chosen subject of his obsession. I no longer felt like a person. I felt like a target, a specimen he was collecting data on, one horrifying interaction at a time. I lay in bed that night, the blinds drawn tight, listening to the sounds of the city. But I was no longer listening for a train. I was listening for a footstep. I was listening for the click of a camera shutter. The game had changed. He had my picture. He had my routine. The only thing I didn't know was what he was going to do next, or how much closer he was planning to get. The weekend was a prison of my own making. I didn't leave my apartment. The drawn blinds a flimsy shield against a world I now perceived as hostile. The flash of his camera had been a brand, marking me as his. The paranoia was no longer a fleeting feeling. It was a permanent state of being, a constant low-level hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my every thought. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that bright white burst of light, a symbol of my stolen privacy. By Monday morning, my fear had curdled into a grim resolve. I could not live like this. I refused to be a passive victim, cowering in my apartment. He had made a move, and now I had to make one of my own. My first stop at the office was not my desk, but the office of my floor manager, a perpetually stressed man named David. I was going to report the incident, to create an official record, to force the sane world to acknowledge my insane reality. I sat in the chair opposite his desk and laid out the story as calmly and as factually as I could. I described the daily observation, the escalating intensity, and finally, the camera flash. I tried to keep my voice even, to present the facts like a data set, devoid of the emotion that was churning inside me. I wanted to be seen as a credible witness, not a hysterical woman. David listened, tapping a pen on his desk, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he sighed, a long, weary sound. "Anna," he said, "I understand that you found this unsettling. But what exactly do you want me to do?" He spread his hands in, a gesture of helplessness. A man on a public train took a picture. For all we know, he was taking a picture of the building, of the skyline. We can't file a report based on the fact that you happen to be in the frame. There's no crime here. His dismissal was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. He was right, of course. From his perspective, my story was a non-event, a strange but harmless interaction. He couldn't feel the weeks of preceding surveillance, the possessive nature of the stare, the sheer violation of the flesh. He saw a single data point. I saw the terrifying culmination of a pattern. He offered to speak to building security, but warned me they would likely tell me the same thing. I left his office feeling defeated and profoundly alone. I had tried to use the system, to follow the proper channels, but the system was not equipped to deal with a threat so subtle, so strange. The incident was too bizarre to be taken seriously. I was on my own. If I wanted to feel safe, I would have to create that safety myself. My anger returned, a cold and practical fury. If I couldn't report him, I would erase myself from his view. My first act was to rearrange my desk. I shifted my monitors to the other side, turning my chair so my back was mostly to the window. It was an awkward, inefficient setup, but it meant that I would no longer be facing the train line. I would be presenting him with nothing but the back of my head and my office chair. It was a small, petty act of defiance, but it felt like I was taking back a small measure of control. Next, I went to a small plant shop during my lunch break. I bought 3 large leafy ferns, plants that were tall and dense. I brought them back to the office, my colleagues giving me strange looks as I carried the small jungle through the building. I placed them strategically on my windowsill, their green fronds creating a natural, living curtain. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would obscure the view, break up the clean line of sight he had enjoyed. My cubicle was transformed. It was now a dark, cramped space, my back to the window, my view of the city blocked by a wall of foliage. It felt claustrophobic and glum, a far cry from the bright open workspace I had once loved. But it also felt safer. I had built a physical barrier, however flimsy, between myself and his gaze. I had taken away his stage. The daily 3:15 performance, I hoped, was now canceled due to a poor view. That afternoon, as 3 o'clock approached, I felt a new kind of tension. It was not the dread of being seen, but the anxious hope of not being seen. I kept my back to the window, my eyes glued to my screen. I heard the distant rumble of the 3:15 train. I fought every instinct to turn around, to peek through the leaves of my new plants. I had to believe in my defenses. I had to trust that I had finally made myself invisible to him. The train rattled past, a familiar sound on the other side of my leafy barricade. I didn't turn. I didn't look. I just sat there, my back to the window, and listened until the sound faded away into the distance. A profound sense of relief washed over me. I had done it. I had broken the cycle. He might have passed by. He might have looked, but he would have seen nothing but a collection of ferns. I had denied him his daily ritual, and the feeling was one of pure, unadulterated victory. The next day, I allowed myself a small, calculated risk. As the 3:15 approached, I casually glanced over my shoulder, peering through a small gap in the leaves. I couldn't see the specific window of his train car clearly, but I could see the blur of passing faces. I scanned them quickly, my heart pounding. I saw no one staring, no one holding a phone, no one paying any attention to my building at all. He wasn't there. Or if he was, my view was now sufficiently obscured. This new reality continued for the rest of the week. Every day at 3:15 I would risk a quick, furtive glance through my green curtain. Every day, I saw nothing but a normal, anonymous train full of normal, anonymous people. The man, my daily observer, had vanished. The empty seat in his usual spot was a testament to my victory. By taking away his view, I had taken away his power. His game required a willing, or at least visible, participant, and I had exited the stage. My confidence began to return in waves. I started to feel less like a target and more like myself again. The constant, low-level hum of anxiety began to fade. I even started to feel a little foolish for the paranoia that had consumed me. Perhaps David, my manager, had been right. It was just a strange man on a train, and my elaborate defenses had been an overreaction. But it didn't matter. Overreaction or not, it had worked. The problem was solved. I began to enjoy my little jungle of an office. The plants made the space feel more alive, more mine. They were a living symbol of my victory, a green wall I had built against the outside world. My colleagues commented on them, joking that I was trying to start my own terrarium. I just smiled and said I needed more greenery in my life. I didn't tell them that they were my shield, my camouflage. The walk home from work was no longer a gauntlet of fear. I stopped scanning the faces in the crowd, stopped looking over my shoulder. The city returned to its normal state, a busy, indifferent, and fundamentally safe place. The man on the train was a fading memory, a strange and unsettling chapter in my life that I was now ready to close. I had faced a threat, I had adapted, and I had neutralized it. I even considered taking the plants home, of reclaiming my window and my view. But I decided against it. It was better to be safe. My new setup was less scenic, certainly, but it was peaceful. The train would pass by, and I would barely register it. Its rumble once again just a part of the ambient noise of the office. I had successfully edited my tormentor out of my daily life. I was in control again. This feeling of accomplishment, of having outsmarted a threat, was deeply empowering. I had been a victim, helpless and afraid, but I had used my own ingenuity to protect myself. I had identified the problem, his line of sight, and I had eliminated it. It was a simple, logical solution, the kind of problem-solving I did every day with my spreadsheets. I had treated my fear like a data set, and I had found the solution, but my victory was based on a dangerously flawed assumption. I had assumed that his obsession was with the view from the train, that our connection was tied to that specific, fleeting moment each day. I believed that by blocking the window, I had broken the link between us. I had treated the symptom, but I had completely misunderstood the disease. His obsession was not with the view, it was with me, and he was not a man to be deterred by a few potted plants. He was patient. He was intelligent. He had let me have my small victory, had allowed me to settle into my new, false sense of security. He had watched me build my flimsy green wall, and he had simply decided to walk around it. My strategy had not ended the game. It had only forced him to change the venue, and his next move would bring him terrifyingly closer. My new sense of peace lasted for a full week. It was a week of blissful, deliberate ignorance. At 3:15 each day, the train would rumble past my window, but it was just a sound now, a harmless ghost of its former menace. I kept my back to it, my view obscured by my leafy green guardians. I had successfully conditioned myself to ignore it, to treat it as meaningless. I had taken back my afternoon, and with it, my sanity. I truly believed the ordeal was over. The feeling of victory was so complete that my paranoia began to feel like a distant, embarrassing memory. I had been a woman on the edge, terrified of a stranger's gaze. Now, I felt strong, resourceful, and in control. I had identified a problem and solved it. I had been threatened and I had defended myself successfully. I was no longer the frightened animal in the glass cage. I was the zookeeper who had reinforced the enclosure, and the predator had simply lost interest and moved on. On the following Wednesday, exactly 1 week after my defensive measures had gone up, I left work feeling perfectly calm. The day had been normal, productive, and blessedly free of any strange occurrences. The 3:15 train had passed without incident, a faint rumble on the other side of my botanical wall. I packed my bag, said goodbye to my colleagues, and headed down to the lobby, my mind on my dinner plans, not on a man on a train. I pushed through the large glass doors of my office building and stepped out onto the busy sidewalk. The cool evening air was a welcome relief after a long day in the stuffy office. I began my usual walk towards the subway station, a journey I had made 1,000 times. The flow of pedestrians was thick, a river of anonymous faces heading home. I was just another drop in that river, anonymous and safe. As I waited at the crosswalk for the light to change, I idly glanced back at my office building. It was a habit, a small unconscious gesture. I looked up at the grid of windows, trying to pick out my own on the 7th floor, and that's when I saw him. He was standing on the sidewalk directly across the street from me, leaning against a lamppost. He was tall, thin, and wearing a dark coat, despite the mild weather. It was the man from the train. My blood turned to ice. The bustling city street seemed to fall silent, the noise of the traffic and the crowds fading into a dull, distant roar. He was not on the train. He was here, on the ground, 20 feet away from me. He was no longer a distant, fleeting image. He was a real, solid, physical presence in my world. He was staring, not at me, but up at my building, his gaze fixed on the 7th floor, on my window. He had bypassed my defenses in the simplest way imaginable. I had blocked his view from the train, so he had simply gotten off the train. He had brought his surveillance down to street level. My clever solution, my wall of plants, my rearranged desk. It was all a complete and utter joke. He wasn't interested in the view from the train. He was interested in me, and he would find a way to watch me, no matter what barriers I put up. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe. I stood on the corner, surrounded by a river of people who were completely oblivious to the silent, terrifying drama unfolding. He just stood there, perfectly still, his gaze unwavering, fixed on my window. He was letting me see him. He wanted me to know that he was here, that my efforts to hide were futile. This was a deliberate, calculated escalation, a new move in his horrifying game. After what felt like an eternity, he slowly lowered his gaze from the window and turned his head. His eyes, dark and empty, scanned the crowd on my side of the street, and then they found me. He looked directly at me, a flicker of something, recognition, triumph, in his otherwise impassive expression. He had seen me see him. The connection was made. He was no longer a phantom. He was a man on a street corner, staring at me. I broke and ran. I didn't wait for the light to change. I turned and plunged back into the crowd, pushing my way through the sea of bodies, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just ran, my mind screaming. He wasn't on the train anymore. He was on my street. He was in my world, and I had no idea what he was going to do next. My journey home was a frantic, paranoid blur. I took the longest, most convoluted route possible, switching subway cars 3 times, my eyes constantly scanning the faces of my fellow passengers. Every tall, thin man in a dark coat was him. Every lingering glance was a threat. He had shattered my sense of security so completely that the entire city now felt like a web of potential dangers, and I was the fly caught in its center. The fear was no longer confined to my office. It was everywhere. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked and deadbolted the door, but the feeling of safety was gone. If he knew where I worked, if he was willing to stand on the street outside my office, what was to stop him from finding out where I lived? He was methodical. He was patient. Finding my home address would be a simple task for someone with his apparent dedication. My apartment was no longer a fortress. It was just the next stop on his terrifying itinerary. I spent the night with all my lights on, jumping at every creak of the building. I replayed the moment on the street corner over and over in my mind. The way he had looked up at my window with such focus, and then the way he had turned and found me in the crowd. He had known I would be leaving work at that time. He had known I would walk that way to the subway. The depth of his surveillance was far greater than I had ever imagined. The next day, going to work felt like walking into the lion's den. My office, my desk, my window. It was all compromised territory. I couldn't concentrate. My gaze was constantly drawn to the window, not to the train tracks anymore, but down to the street below. I scanned the tiny figures on the sidewalk, searching for his tall, thin frame, for his dark coat. I was now a watcher, just like him, but my watching was born of terror, not obsession. At 3:15, the train passed. I didn't even register it. My focus was entirely on the street. He wasn't there. The lamppost where he had stood was just a lamppost. This brought me no relief. It only deepened the mystery. His pattern was no longer predictable. He had abandoned the routine of the train. He was mobile now. He could be anywhere. The unpredictability was a new and potent form of psychological torture. The email arrived at 4 o'clock. It slipped into my work inbox. A single, unread message that immediately drew my eye. The sender was an anonymous, encrypted address, a jumble of letters and numbers designed to be untraceable. But it was the subject line that made my blood run cold. It was just 2 numbers and a colon. 3:15. My heart stopped. He had breached my digital space. My hand trembled as I moved the mouse, the cursor hovering over the message. This was a direct communication. After weeks of silent observation, he was finally speaking to me, in his own cryptic way. I knew I shouldn't open it. I knew I should call IT, call the police, call someone. But I also knew they wouldn't be able to do anything. And my need to know, my desperate, terrifying curiosity, was stronger than my fear. I clicked the email open. The body of the email was completely blank. There was no text, no message, no explanation. There was only a single attachment, a small image file with a generic name. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my mind racing. This was it. This was the culmination of his game. This was the prize from his hunt. With a sense of fated dread, I double-clicked the file. The image opened, filling my screen. It was the photograph. It was the picture he had taken from the train, the one from the day of the flash. It was me. I was sitting at my desk, bathed in the afternoon light, my face a portrait of concentration. The quality was surprisingly clear. He had a good lens. He had captured every detail. The succulents on my windowsill, the photo of my sister on my desk, the title of the report I was working on. I stared at my own captured image, a version of me from a time before the true terror had begun. It was a picture of the last moments of my innocence, taken by the very person who was about to destroy it. He hadn't just taken a picture. He had found my work email address, an address that was not public. He had sent me the proof of his crime. He was not just a stalker. He was a ghost who knew how to navigate the digital world as silently and as menacingly as he navigated the physical one. I slammed my laptop shut with a loud crack, as if I could physically close the portal through which he had just invaded my life. But the image was already burned into my mind. The photograph. It existed. It was real. It was now on my computer. A piece of digital evidence that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, validating. I was not going crazy. The threat was real, and now I had the proof. My fear was now mingled with a new, frantic energy. I had to show someone. My first stop was back at my manager David's office. I didn't bother to knock. I burst in, my laptop clutched in my hands like a shield. "You have to see this," I said, my voice trembling but firm. I placed the laptop on his desk and opened it, displaying the email, the anonymous sender, the subject line, and the horrifying attachment. I watched, his face as he looked at the picture of me at my desk, taken from the train. I willed him to see the menace in it that I saw. He stared at the screen for a long time, his expression shifting from confusion to a kind of weary concern. "Okay," he said slowly, leaning back in his chair. "That's definitely creepy, Anna. I'll give you that." He looked at me, his eyes full of a frustratingly calm pity. "But it's probably just some elaborate prank. Some tech kid with too much time on his hands. It's unsettling, but there's no threat here. It's just a picture." "He was standing on the street yesterday, David," I insisted, my voice rising. "He knows my work email. This isn't a prank. This is stalking." David just shook his head, his hands clasped behind his head. "Look, I'll forward this to IT and have them look at the sender's address. But my advice to you is to just delete the email, block the sender, and try to forget about it. Don't feed the trolls, you know?" He was trying to manage the situation, not solve it. To him, this was a human resources issue, not a threat to my safety. Defeated, I took my laptop and went directly to the IT department in the basement. I showed the email to a young, world-weary technician named Ben. He looked at the sender's encrypted address and let out a low whistle. "Proton mail," he said, shaking his head. "End-to-end encryption. Bounces through a dozen servers in different countries. We can block this specific address, sure, but he can create 100 more in 5 minutes. There is absolutely no way to trace this. It's a digital ghost." His words were a death knell to my hope of a technical solution. The man on the train was not an amateur. He knew exactly how to operate in the digital world without leaving a trace. He had built himself a cloak of invisibility. Ben offered to put a more aggressive spam filter on my account, a solution so pathetic it was almost insulting. He was offering me a paper shield against a man who could walk through walls. My last stop was building security. I spoke to the head, guard, a former cop with a cynical, seen-it-all attitude. I showed him the photo. I told him about the man on the street. He listened, his arms crossed, his expression impassive. "Ma'am," he said when I was finished, "I sympathize, but what crime has been committed?" A man stood on a public sidewalk. "You received an email that contains no threatening language. My hands are tied. We can't trespass someone from a public street." "But he's watching me," I pleaded, the desperation raw in my voice. "He's taking pictures. He's sending them to my work email. Isn't that harassment?" The guard sighed. "It's harassment when a court says it's harassment. Right now it's just a weirdo being a weirdo. If he makes a direct threat, if he tries to enter the building, then we can do something. Until then, my advice is to be vigilant and maybe keep your blinds closed." The same useless advice. The same dismissal. I returned to my desk, my last hopes extinguished. I had done everything right. I had reported the incident through every proper channel, and at every turn, I had been met with a wall of bureaucracy, skepticism, and impotence. The systems that were designed to protect me were completely useless against a threat so modern, so subtle, so perfectly designed to exist in the legal and digital gray areas. He had all the power, and I had none. My colleagues tried to be supportive, but they couldn't understand. They would offer comforting but empty platitudes. "Just ignore him. He'll get bored and move on." What a creep. They saw the situation as a creepy anecdote, a story I would one day tell at a dinner party. They couldn't see the relentless, obsessive pattern behind it. They couldn't feel the weight of his daily, unwavering stare. Their lack of understanding only made me feel more alone. I was truly, utterly alone now, trapped in a nightmare that the rest of the world refused to. See, my tormentor had created the perfect crime, one that existed in the spaces between jurisdictions, between a public street and a private email account. His harassment was a ghost, leaving behind only the cold chill of my own fear as evidence. And fear was not a thing I could file in a report. He had made me the sole witness to his campaign, and the world had deemed me an unreliable one. That evening, I called my sister, my last resort. I needed an ally, someone who knew me, who trusted me, who would believe my story no matter how strange it sounded. I told her everything, my voice low and urgent, trying to convey the gravity without sounding unhinged. I told her about the daily, staring, the flash, the man on the street, and finally the email with the photograph. I sent her the image, my one piece of concrete proof. She called me back immediately, her voice tight with concern. "Annie, this is really weird," she admitted. "But are you sure this is all connected? The man on the street could be a different person. And this email, it's creepy. But it could be some kind of sophisticated phishing scam, or a random prank. Someone could have taken that picture months ago." She was trying to break the pattern, to find a rational explanation for each piece, refusing to see the terrifying whole. "It's him, Sarah," I insisted, my voice cracking. "I saw his face in a reflection. It's the same man. He's doing this deliberately." I could hear her sigh on the other end of the line, the same weary sigh I had heard from my boss, from the security guard. It was the sound of someone confronting a problem they did not want to solve. It was the sound of disbelief, couched in love. "Okay, honey. But you have to admit, it sounds crazy," she said gently. "Maybe you should just take a few days off. The pressure at your job. Maybe you just need to unplug for a little while. Let this weirdo move on to someone else." Her words meant to be comforting, were a dagger in my heart. She didn't believe me. She believed I was overwrought, stressed, and unable to see things clearly. She thought the problem was my reaction, not his actions. I ended the call, promising I would think about it. But I knew there was nothing to think about. I had now been dismissed by my boss, my IT department, building security, and my own sister. My social and professional support systems had all failed me. They had all looked at the evidence and concluded that the most likely explanation was not a determined high-tech stalker, but a young woman who was simply cracking under pressure. My isolation was now complete. My tormentor had successfully created a bubble of terror around me that was invisible to everyone else. To the outside world, I was the anomaly, the one who was acting strangely. He, the man on the train, the man on the street, the digital ghost, remained completely invisible, completely protected by the sheer audacity and strangeness of his methods. He had made my reality unbelievable. I sat in my apartment that night, the blinds drawn, every light on. I felt like I was losing my mind, because to stay sane, I had to believe in a truth that everyone else I trusted had rejected. The world had told me I was wrong. My boss, the police, my sister. But the photograph on my computer screen told me I was right. I was trapped between my own sanity and the consensus of the entire world. The feeling of powerlessness was absolute. He could watch me, he could photograph me, he could email me, and there was nothing I could do to stop him, and no one I could turn to for help. He had successfully isolated his target. He had cut me off from the herd. I was alone with him now, in a game where he made all the rules and was the only other player. And I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that he wasn't finished. The photograph from the train had been a test, a way to see how I would react, who I would run to, and he had seen my failed attempts. He had seen my isolation. He knew I was alone, and now that he knew I had no one to protect me, his next move would be bolder. He was ready to show me just how close he could really get. After the call with my sister, a profound and desolate resignation settled over me. I had exhausted all my options. The world had rendered its verdict. My fear was a fantasy, a private delusion. I stopped trying to convince anyone. I stopped talking about it altogether. I went to work, I sat at my desk, and I built a wall of silence around myself. My terror was a secret I now shared with only one other person, the man who was causing it. My days became a performance. I pretended to be fine. I smiled at my colleagues. I made small talk in the break room. I submitted my reports on time, but it was all a fragile facade. Underneath, I was in a constant state of high alert. Every new email made my heart leap. Every time the elevator doors opened, I braced myself, half expecting to see his gaunt face staring back at me. My life had become a masterclass in feigned normalcy. I lived in dread of 3:15. When the train passed now, I didn't look. I kept my eyes glued to my screen, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. I didn't need to look anymore. I knew he was there. I could feel his gaze, a phantom pressure against the back of my neck. But I refused to give him the satisfaction of my attention. My only remaining form of defiance was to ignore him. A pathetic and utterly useless gesture that did nothing to quell the fear churning inside me. I existed like this for 2 weeks, in a state of suspended terror. There were no new emails, no new photographs. The man on the train continued his silent, daily vigil, and I continued my silent, daily refusal to acknowledge him. It was a cold war, a battle of wills waged across a few hundred feet of open air. But I knew it was only a temporary truce. He was patient. He was waiting for me to break. He was waiting for the perfect moment to escalate again. The next email arrived on a Thursday, late in the afternoon. It appeared in my inbox with the same quiet finality as the first one. The sender was another jumble of encrypted nonsense. The subject line was the same cold, simple message, 3:15. My blood ran cold. He was back. The truce was over. He had decided it was time to make his next move. For a long moment, I just stared at the screen, my entire body frozen in dread. A part of me wanted to delete it without opening it, to simply refuse delivery of his next piece of psychological torture. But I knew I couldn't. The not knowing would be worse. His power lay in the unknown, in the anticipation. To understand his new move, I had to see it. I had to know what new horror he had concocted for me. With a trembling hand, I moved the cursor and clicked open the email. Like before, the body was blank. It contained only a single attached image file. My heart pounded against my ribs as I double-clicked on it, the image slowly loading onto my screen, line by agonizing line. It was another photograph of me. I was at my desk, my head bent in concentration, a pen tucked behind my ear. It was a picture taken that very day. I recognized the blue sweater I was wearing. At first, I felt a familiar wave of violation and fear. He had photographed me again. But as I looked closer at the image, a new and far more terrifying realization began to dawn on me. Something was wrong with the picture. The angle was wrong. It was not the same perspective as the first photograph. It was not the view from the elevated train tracks. The first photograph had been taken from slightly below and to the left, consistent with the angle of the passing 3:15 train. This new photograph was different. It was taken from a higher vantage point and further to the right. It was a clearer, more direct shot. It was a perspective that could not have been achieved from the train. It was the perspective of someone looking out of a different window. My mind raced, frantically trying to process the impossible geometry of the photograph. Higher, and to the right. That would mean it was taken from inside my own office building, from a different window, on the same floor, or perhaps a floor above mine. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs. He was not on the train. He was not on the street. He was in the building with me. He was inside the building. The thought was a key turning in a lock, opening a new, vast, and infinitely more terrifying room in my own private prison. The train had been a shield for him, a clever piece of misdirection. I had been so focused on the threat from the outside that I had never once considered the possibility that the threat was already on the inside, sharing the same recycled air, walking the same carpeted hallways, riding the same elevators. My office, my cubicle, my entire workplace, which I had seen as a compromised but ultimately separate space from the threat, was now the heart of it. He was a colleague, or a maintenance worker, or a visitor who had gotten a temporary pass. He was someone who had legitimate access to this building. He could be anyone. The man in the next cubicle, the IT guy who had so casually dismissed me, even David, my own manager. Every single person in this building was now a suspect. A wave of intense claustrophobic paranoia washed over me. The low hum of the office, the sound that had once been a comfort, now sounded like the breathing of a monster. I looked out over the sea of cubicles, at the familiar faces of my co-workers, and saw only masks. Which one was him? Who among these normal, boring people was the ghost who haunted me? The man with the hollow eyes from the mugshot. Was he here right now, watching my reaction? I immediately deleted the email, my hand moving with a frantic, instinctual need to erase the evidence. It was a foolish gesture. I knew he likely had copies, but I couldn't bear to have that image on my screen for a second longer. I felt as if the photo itself was a window, and he could see me through it, watching as my carefully constructed composure finally, completely shattered. My digital world was as compromised as my physical one. I had to get out. I couldn't stay. Here another minute. I began to pack my bag, my movements small and quiet, trying to appear normal. I didn't want to alert him, whoever he was. I didn't want him to see my panic. I felt like I was an actor on a stage, and I had just been given a horrifying new script, and I had to play my part until the curtain fell. I had to pretend everything was fine until I could get out of the building. Every friendly good night from a colleague felt like a threat. Every smile seemed like a mask. The normal, mundane, end-of-day rituals were now freighted with a terrifying new significance. I was walking through a minefield, and any one of the people I had worked with for years could be the one who had planted the mines. My professional life, my career, my entire sense of adult competency had been hollowed out and filled with fear. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I stood in the corner, my eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the gaze of the other passengers. Was he in here with me? Was the man standing next to me, the one I had just shared a polite nod with, the same man who had been taking my picture, who knew my work email, who was systematically destroying my life? The air in the small car was thick and unbreathable. I burst out of the building and onto the street, the cool evening air doing nothing to calm the fire of panic in my chest. The world was no longer divided into safe and unsafe spaces. It was all unsafe. He could watch me from the train. He could watch me from the street. And now I knew, with absolute certainty, that he could watch me from just a few feet away, from behind the guise of a normal, everyday person. My apartment, my home, was no longer a sanctuary. It was just a place I hadn't been violated in yet, but it was only a matter of time. He knew where I worked. He knew my name. Finding my home address would be a trivial task for a man with his resources and his obsession. There was no escaping him. He had successfully invaded every aspect of my life. I stood on the corner, the same corner where I had seen him just weeks before, and I felt a despair so total, so absolute, that it was almost a physical weight. My defenses were gone. My allies did not believe me. My safe spaces were compromised. The second act of his play was over, and it had ended with this final, devastating revelation. I had nowhere left to run, and no one to run to. I was completely and utterly alone. The weekend was a blur of sleeplessness and quiet, simmering panic. I didn't leave my apartment. I sat in the dark, the blinds drawn, replaying the sequence of events over and over. The man on the train, the man on the street, the anonymous, emails, and now, the final devastating proof, the photograph from within my own building. He was no longer an outside threat. He was inside the fortress, walking among us, and I had no idea who he was. My world had shrunk to the size of my small, locked apartment. But something happens when you are pushed to the absolute limit, when all your options have been exhausted and all your hope for outside help has been extinguished. the despair. So heavy and so absolute, can become so dense that it collapses in on itself. By Sunday night, my paralyzing fear had begun to transform. It was calcifying, hardening into a cold, sharp, and intensely focused rage. I had nothing left to lose, and that realization was, in its own way, liberating. He had taken my peace, my sanity, my sense of safety in the world. He had turned my colleagues into suspects, and my workplace into a hunting ground. I was done being the prey. I was done hiding and cowering and waiting for the next blow to fall. If I was going to be destroyed, I would not go quietly. The victim was dead. In her place was a survivor, and a survivor fights back with whatever tools she has at her disposal. My mind, so accustomed to analyzing data and finding patterns, began to work with a new, feverish clarity. I was no longer analyzing spreadsheets. I was analyzing my enemy. He was arrogant. He was intelligent. He enjoyed the psychological game, the slow, methodical dismantling of my life. He felt safe, protected by his anonymity and my own isolation. His confidence was his greatest weakness, and I was going to use it against him. I would not run. I would not quit my job. To do so would be to give him the victory he so clearly craved. No, I would go back to the office on Monday, but I would go back as a different person. I would not be the frightened, paranoid woman from last week. I would be a hunter, disguised as a data analyst. I would walk back into the lion's den, but this time, I would be the one setting the trap. My plan began to form, a desperate, dangerous strategy born of pure rage. He had used technology to terrorize me, to invade my life. I would use the same tools to unmask him. I needed his face, not the fleeting, blurry image from my memory, but a clear, undeniable photograph that I could take to the authorities, that I could show the world. I needed to turn his own methods of surveillance back on him. I spent the rest of Sunday preparing. I went to an electronics store and bought a small, high-resolution spy camera, the kind disguised as a USB charger. It was a tiny, innocuous object that no one would ever look at twice. I also bought a portable power bank to ensure it could run for hours without being plugged into a wall. I was building my own secret surveillance system, a countermeasure to his. My new mission was simple. I needed to identify which other office had the same line of sight to my desk as the one in the photograph. The angle was high and to the right. That meant it had to be a corner office, either on my floor or one of the floors directly above me. The pool of potential locations was small. There were only a handful of offices that fit that description. He had made a mistake. He had given me a clue. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a feeling I hadn't felt in weeks that was not related to fear. It was the thrill of the hunt. I was no longer just a set of data points for him to analyze. I was an opposing force. I was an anomaly he would not see coming. The game had been one-sided for too long. It was time to make my own move, to introduce a new, unexpected variable into his carefully controlled experiment. On Monday morning, I walked into my office building with my head held high. I smiled at the security guard. I made small talk with my colleagues in the elevator. I was performing the role of Anna, the normal office worker, with an Oscar-worthy conviction. But beneath the surface, I was a different person entirely. I was a hunter, and my prey was somewhere in this building with me. And I would not rest until I had found him. My first task was reconnaissance. I spent the morning studying the photograph on my phone, memorizing the angle, the perspective. It was definitely from the same floor or a floor above. I pulled up the company directory and the floor plan, cross-referencing the names of the employees who occupied the corner offices on the 7th, 8th, and 9th floors. I created a new spreadsheet, not of logistics data, but of suspects and locations. It was a kill list of a different kind. I created a pretext. I told David I was working on a cross-departmental efficiency report and needed to briefly speak with managers on other floors. It was a plausible lie, just corporate enough to be completely uninteresting to anyone. He waved me on, more concerned with his own deadlines than my sudden interest in inter-office synergy. My first stop was the 8th floor, to the corner office, directly above the one I suspected. Walking through the other floors of my own building felt like infiltrating an enemy compound. Every person I passed was a potential threat. I smiled, I nodded, I made polite small talk. All the while my mind was racing, my eyes scanning for any sign of recognition, any flicker of the same hollow-eyed gaze I had seen in the mugshot that was now burned into my brain. The performance was exhausting, but my rage fueled me. The corner office on the 8th floor was occupied by a cheerful, middle-aged woman in marketing who offered me a piece of candy from a jar on her desk. The view from her window was close, but not quite right. It was too high. The angle was too steep. I thanked her for her time and left, crossing her name off my mental list. The process of elimination was slow, but it was working. I was narrowing the field. My next stop was the 7th floor, my own floor, to the corner office at the opposite end of the building. It belonged to a senior accountant who was rarely there. I peered through the small glass window on his door. The office was empty, dark, and the angle, it was perfect. It was a clear, direct line of sight to my cubicle, to my chair, to my desk. This was it. This was his vantage point. Now for the trap. I waited until my lunch break, when the hallways were mostly empty. I had my spy camera disguised as a phone charger in my pocket. My heart was pounding. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. With a feigned air of casualness, I walked over to the empty office. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. Of course it was unlocked. He needed to be able to get in and out easily. I slipped inside, my pulse roaring in my ears. The office was generic and impersonal. I quickly found a power outlet on the wall that was partially obscured by a filing cabinet but still had a clear view of the window, and by extension, my own cubicle across the way. I plugged in the fake charger. A tiny pinprick of blue light blinked once, then went dark. It was active. It was recording. I left the office as quietly as I had entered, my mission accomplished. The feeling of turning the tables, of placing him under surveillance was a heady, intoxicating mixture of terror and triumph. He thought he was the only one watching. He had no idea that a tiny, silent, digital eye was now waiting for him in his own secret sniper's nest. I had invaded his space, just as he had invaded mine. I returned to my desk and sat down, my back to the window. But for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel exposed. I felt powerful. I had set my trap. I had laid my snare. I was no longer just waiting for his next move. I was actively documenting it, gathering the evidence that would finally bring him down. The hunter had become the hunted. All I had to do now was wait. I had to go about my day, pretending that nothing had changed, all the while knowing that my secret camera was watching, waiting. I had to wait for him to return to the scene of his crime, to his quiet corner office vantage point. And when he did, I would have him. I would have his face, his identity, the undeniable proof I needed to end this nightmare once and for all. The rest of the day was the most excruciating performance of my life. I had to sit at my desk, just a few hundred feet from my hidden camera, and pretend to be engrossed in my work. Every click of a keyboard, every ringing phone, every footstep in the hallway sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Was it him? Was he on his way to his vantage point? I felt like a bomb maker who has just set the timer and now has to sit next to the device, acting naturally. I resisted the urge to constantly check my phone, where a live feed from the camera was accessible. I couldn't risk it. If he was watching me, he would see my focus shift, my anxiety spike. I had to maintain the illusion of the beaten, passive victim. I had to appear as if I had given up. This was the most crucial part of the trap. My own feigned normalcy was the bait that would lure him into the open, into the view of my secret, waiting eye. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. 3:15 came and went. I felt the rumble of the train through the floor, but I did not. Look, my battle was no longer with the view from the window. It was with an enemy who was much, much closer. I forced myself to focus on a spreadsheet, my fingers typing out formulas, my mind a million miles away, fixed on the dark, empty corner office at the end of the hall. At 4:30, just as people were beginning to pack up for the day, I saw movement. It was not from the office itself, but a flicker of motion in the hallway reflected in the polished surface of a picture frame on a nearby cubicle wall. Someone was heading towards the corner office. My heart began to pound, a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. This was it. He was there. I kept my head down, my eyes on my screen. Every muscle in my body tensed. I waited another hour, an hour that felt like a lifetime, before I allowed myself to leave. I packed my bag, said my goodbyes, and walked out of the office, never once looking in the direction of the corner office. I had to maintain the performance until the very end. The walk to the subway, the ride home, it was all a blur. My entire consciousness was focused on the small memory card in the hidden camera, on the digital ghost I had hopefully, finally, captured. Once inside my apartment, the chain on the door, I didn't even take off my coat. I threw my bag on the floor and pulled out my laptop, my hands shaking as I connected my phone to it. I opened the application for the spy camera. The live feed showed an empty, dark office, but the application also showed that the camera's motion sensor had been triggered for a period of 7 minutes, starting at 4:32 p.m. I had him. I navigated to the recordings folder, my breath held tight in my chest. I found the video file, its timestamp confirming the time of the recording. I clicked play. The video was grainy, the angle low, but the image was clear. It showed the empty office, the window with its perfect, terrible view of my own desk. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then, the door to the office opened, and a man stepped inside. It was him. The gaunt face, the dark coat, the hollow, haunted eyes. He looked exactly as he had in the fleeting reflection, a specter of quiet, sorrowful menace. He didn't turn on the lights. He walked directly to the window and stood there, perfectly still, looking out towards my cubicle. He was so close. He had been so close this entire time. Seeing him on my own recording, from my own camera, was a terrifying, empowering moment. He stood at the window for 5 full minutes, a silent, motionless sentinel. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't taking pictures. He was just watching. He was absorbing the scene, drinking it in. It was a ritual of pure observation. Then, as calmly as he had entered, he turned and walked out of the office, closing the door softly behind him. The video ended a minute later. I had his face, a clear, high-resolution image of my tormentor. I took a screenshot of the clearest frame, the one where he first entered the room, his face fully illuminated by the light from the hallway. I opened a browser and uploaded the image to a powerful, reverse image search engine. The gears of the internet began to turn, searching for a match, for a name to go with the face that had been haunting me. After a few seconds, the results came in, and I finally learned the name of my ghost. His name was Thomas Weaver. The name, Thomas Weaver, meant nothing to me, but it was a start. It was a solid piece of data in a sea of terrifying ambiguity. The search results linked his name to a series of articles from a major city newspaper, dated about 5 years ago. I clicked on the first link, my heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. I was about to look into the face of the abyss, to finally understand the nature of the man who had made my life a living hell. Thomas Weaver had been a journalist. Not just any journalist, but a highly regarded investigative reporter, known for his long-form, immersive pieces on the quiet, unseen lives of ordinary people. He had won awards for his ability to capture the poetry of the mundane. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He had built a career on the very thing he was now using to terrorize me, watching people's routines. But the articles weren't celebrating his career. They were documenting its spectacular implosion. The headline of the main article read, "Reporter fired amidst scandal of fabrication and harassment." I read on, my blood running cold. Weaver had been fired after it was discovered that he had fabricated sources for several of his most famous stories. But the real scandal, the one buried further down in the article, was much, much darker. Several of the female subjects of his articles had come forward with eerily similar stories. They spoke of his methods being unusually invasive. He would watch them for weeks before ever making contact. He would learn their routines, their habits, their favorite coffee shops. They all reported a profound, unsettling feeling of being constantly watched, of their lives being observed under a microscope long before they ever agreed to an interview. One woman, a librarian he had profiled, described how he knew the exact time she took her lunch break every day. Another, a subway musician, said he had taken photos of her from across the platform for a week before introducing himself. He wasn't just researching his subjects, he was stalking them. He was becoming obsessed with them, blurring the line between professional observation and a dangerous, personal fixation. The article detailed how his behavior would escalate. He would send anonymous emails, testing their reactions. He would leave small, seemingly insignificant objects for them to find, things he had observed them losing. He was creating a narrative, a secret relationship between himself and his subjects, long before they even knew he existed. It was a pattern. My pattern. The red shirt, the glove on the train. It wasn't a ghost. It was a methodology. My situation was not unique. I was not his first. I was just the latest in a series of women he had chosen to be the subject of his twisted, obsessive journalism. The realization was horrifying. I was not being haunted by a phantom or a random creep. I was being systematically targeted by a known predator, a man who had done this before. A man who had a practiced, proven method for dismantling a person's sense of security. The article didn't mention any physical violence, but it spoke of profound psychological distress, of the long-lasting trauma his subjects endured. He was a professional gaslighter, a man who got a thrill from the quiet, intimate act of surveillance and the power it gave him. He was a collector of lives, and my life was his new, fascinating project. The train, the emails, the photographs. They were just his research, his field notes for a story he was writing with me as the unwilling main character. All the pieces now fit together in a monstrous, cohesive whole. He had likely lost his job, his access, his credentials, but not his obsession. So he had found a new way to practice his craft. The elevated train provided the perfect anonymous vantage point. He had likely watched my office building for weeks, patiently searching for a new subject, a new routine to document. And one day, he had chosen me. I leaned back in my chair, the articles glowing on my screen. I had the truth. I had his name, his face, his history, his methods. But the truth was no comfort. The revelation was not a shield. It was just a detailed description of the monster that was hunting me. He was not a grieving man or a simple stalker. He was a disgraced professional, an expert in the art of psychological violation, and he was practicing his terrible craft on me. And I knew his story was far from finished. The knowledge of his identity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, he was no longer a phantom. He had a name, Thomas Weaver. He had a history. He was a real, tangible person, and that made him feel, in some small way, more vulnerable. But on the other hand, the knowledge of his past, of his methodical, practiced cruelty, was a new and more profound kind of terror. I was not his first victim. This was a pattern, a pathology, and there was no reason to believe he would ever just stop. My initial plan, to simply get his picture and go to the authorities, now felt dangerously insufficient. I had seen how they had dismissed me when he was just a ghost. Would a grainy photo and a 5-year-old news article be enough to spur them to action now? I doubted it. They would see a disgraced man and a frightened woman, but still no new concrete crime. I knew I couldn't rely on them. If I wanted this to end, I had to end it myself. My mindset shifted once more. I was no longer just a hunter trying to identify my prey. I was now a trapper, trying to ensnare a specific known predator. I had his name, his face, and most importantly, I knew his methods. He enjoyed the game of surveillance, the feeling of power that came from watching and being unseen. He had been inside my building. He felt safe here. I would use that misplaced sense of safety against him. I formulated a new, more dangerous plan. I would stay late at the office long after everyone else had gone home. I would make myself the perfect isolated target, a single light burning in the dark, empty building. I would be the bait in the final decisive trap. But this time, I would not be entirely alone. I had his face, and that was a powerful tool. I went to the head of security, the same cynical man who had dismissed me before. This time, I didn't tell him about my feelings or my fear. I presented him with data. I showed him the clear, time-stamped screenshot of Thomas Weaver from my spy camera inside the locked corner office. This man, I said, my voice cold and steady, has been trespassing in this building. He is a disgraced journalist with a documented history of stalking. I am afraid he will return. I am staying late tonight to finish a project, and I want you to be aware of the situation. The security guard looked at the clear image of the man's face, then at the timestamp. He saw the proof. His cynical demeanor cracked, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. An identifiable, unauthorized person. Inside a locked office was something he could understand. It was a tangible security breach. He promised he would keep a close eye on the security monitors for the 7th floor. and do a patrol every hour. It was the first time an authority figure had truly believed me. That night, the office was a vast, silent sea of darkness. My cubicle was a tiny, lonely island of light. Everyone else had gone home, their laughter and goodbyes echoing in the empty halls before fading into silence. I sat at my desk, pretending to work, my body humming with a high-frequency current of fear and adrenaline. The entire 7th floor was mine and his, a private arena for our final confrontation. I had left the door to the corner office slightly ajar. I had turned off my hidden camera. I didn't need any more pictures. I needed a confrontation. I needed to see him, to face him, to let him know that I knew who he was. I needed to break the spell of his anonymity, to turn the tables and show him that he was the one being watched now. The hunter was waiting for the hunter. Hours passed. The city lights twinkled outside my window, a beautiful distant world that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The only sounds were the low hum of my computer and the frantic beating of my own heart. I thought about the train. It would have passed hours ago, its 3:15 appointment long since rendered obsolete. The game had moved on from that distant, moving stage. It had come here, to this quiet, empty office. At just after 9 o'clock, I heard it. The soft electronic chime of the elevator arriving on our floor. My breath caught in my throat. I quickly minimized my work screen, leaving only the photograph of his face open on my monitor, angled so it would be the first thing anyone approaching my desk would see. I swiveled my chair to face the entrance of my cubicle, my hands gripping, the armrests. I was ready. I heard the soft footsteps coming down the carpeted hallway, slow and unhurried. They were the steps of a man who believed he belonged here, who believed he was alone. My heart hammered against my ribs. A wild bird, trapped in a cage. He was coming. He had taken the bait. The final scene was about to begin. The footsteps stopped just outside my cubicle. I looked up and met his eyes. It was Thomas Weaver. He stood there, a tall, gaunt figure, his face just as haunted as it had been in the photograph. He looked at me, and then his gaze drifted past me to my computer monitor. He saw his own face staring back at him. A flicker of surprise for the very first time crossed his features. It was not fear. It was a kind of professional curiosity, the look of a chess master seeing an unexpected but intriguing move from his opponent. The game had changed, and he knew it. "So," he said, his voice quiet, raspy, and unnervingly calm. "The subject is now aware of the observer. This changes the nature of the study, but it doesn't end it. In fact, it makes it more interesting." He took a step into my cubicle, his presence sucking all the air out of the small space. "I was wondering when you would start to look back. You have a fascinatingly predictable routine, Anna. A beautiful data set." I stared at him, speechless. He spoke my name with a chilling familiarity, as if he had been saying it to himself for weeks. This was not the violent confrontation I had prepared for. This was something worse. It was a calm, academic discussion of my own torture. He was not a monster. He was a scientist, and I was his favorite experiment. The alarms in my bag felt like useless toys against the sheer, confident force of his obsession. "Your defensive measures were quite rudimentary," he continued, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. "The plants were a nice aesthetic touch, but ultimately futile. You can't block every angle. There's always another window, another perspective. The goal isn't just to see, It's to understand the subject's reaction to being seen, and your reactions have been textbook. Fascinating. He was critiquing my performance in the horror movie he had created for me. Just as he took another step closer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the end of the hallway. It was the security guard, making his hourly patrol just as he had promised. Weaver's head snapped up, his calm demeanor finally breaking, replaced by the sharp, alert look of an animal that has heard a predator. He looked at me one last time, a look of profound disappointment, as if I had cheated, as if I had ruined the purity of his experiment by inviting the outside world in. He didn't run. He simply turned and walked away, not towards the elevators, but deeper into the darkened office floor. The security guard came around the corner, saw me, and then saw the retreating figure of Weaver disappearing into the shadows. "Hey, stop! Right there!" he yelled, his voice booming in the empty space as he took off after him. But it was useless. Weaver knew this building. He was a ghost, and he simply vanished into its walls. He was never caught. By the time the police arrived, he was long gone. They found the vacant corner office he had been using, but it was wiped clean, not a single fingerprint or trace of him left behind. My testimony, along with the security guards, and the clear photo I had, was enough to open a formal investigation. But it was just a file in a cabinet. Thomas Weaver had disappeared back into the digital and physical shadows from which he had emerged. I quit my job the next day. I couldn't go back into that building. I sold my apartment and moved to a different city, taking a job with a small company that had its office in a basement. There are no windows here. My desk faces a solid concrete wall. I have built a new life for myself, a life of deliberate, chosen obscurity. I have tried to make myself as uninteresting, as unobservable as possible. But I know with a chilling certainty that it is not over. I am forever changed. A woman who looks for cameras in every corner, who scrutinizes the faces of strangers, who can never truly feel unobserved. He taught me that there is always another angle, always another window. He is a ghost who knows how to find people. And I know that one day he will get bored of his other projects, and his attention will return to me. My story is his masterpiece, and it is unfinished. Just this morning, I received an email at my new work account, an address that is not public, that is known by only a handful of people. The sender was anonymous, the address a jumble of untraceable letters and numbers. The subject line was empty, but there was an attachment, a single photograph. It was of me, taken just yesterday, walking from my car to my new windowless office. The angle was impossible, from a high rooftop across the street. And underneath the photo was a single line of text. "I see you.